Rome 107 BC. A consul named Gaius Marius is staring at a problem that should be impossible. Rome controls most of the Mediterranean world. Its treasury is full. The cities are thriving. And its army, the most feared fighting force the ancient world has ever seen, is running out of men. Not because Romans stopped being born, but because Roman law said you couldn't be a soldier unless you owned land. And across Italy, the small farms that once produced citizen soldiers had been swallowed up by wealthy estates worked by slaves. The men who should have been defending Rome now own nothing. They didn't qualify. They couldn't serve. Marius looked at this and made a decision that seemed, at the time, like a practical fix to a personnel shortage. He threw out the property requirement. He opened the legions to the landless poor, equipped them at state expense, and promised them land when their service ended. What he accidentally built was something the ancient world had never seen before and wouldn't see again for nearly 1,000 years. A self-replicating military machine. A system that didn't depend on the courage of kings, the genius of generals, or the loyalty of noblemen. A machine that could be broken, reassembled, and sent out again. That absorbed catastrophic losses and returned stronger. That operated on psychological principles so precise that modern military science keeps rediscovering them. This is the story of that machine. What it was, how it actually worked, and why understanding it forces a deeply uncomfortable question about how power really functions. Then and now. To understand why what Rome built was revolutionary, you first need to understand what every other army in the ancient world actually was. Most ancient militaries were not standing forces. They were moments. Greece's great victories at Marathon and Thermopylae were fought by citizen farmers who picked up their spears for a campaign season and went home to their olive groves when it ended. The Macedonian phalanx under Alexander was extraordinary but existed almost entirely inside one man's lifetime. Carthage's armies were often mercenary assemblies, Iberian swordsmen, Numidian cavalry, Gallic warriors, held together by pay and the personality of a commander. When the pay stopped or the commander fell, the army dissolved. Every one of these forces was dependent on something fragile. A season, a genius, contract, a harvest. Rome's post-Marian army was dependent on none of those things. It was dependent on a system. And that single difference explains almost everything that followed. When Marius opened the legions to landless Romans, something happened that no one fully anticipated. For the first time in Roman history, soldiers had no life to return to. A citizen farmer who served a summer campaign was psychologically still a farmer who happened to be holding a sword. His identity was rooted in his land, his family, his village. The legion was temporary. But the man Marius recruited owned nothing, had nothing waiting. The legion wasn't an interruption to his life. It was his life. This created a psychological transformation that Roman commanders would spend the next century learning to exploit. When human beings invest deeply in something, when they give up other options, accept hardship, and tie their identity to a group, the mind does something predictable and powerful. It begins to justify those sacrifices by deepening its commitment. Abandoning the group stops feeling like a rational choice and starts feeling like self-destruction. Roman soldiers didn't stay loyal simply because of discipline or fear of punishment. They stayed loyal because the legion had become who they were. You can see this in the way Roman soldiers behaved around their standards. The eagle, the Aquila, carried at the front of every legion. When the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, losing 3 eagles to Germanic warriors, the emotional response across Rome was closer to grief than military embarrassment. Those weren't flags. They were identity made of metal. Augustus reportedly walked the halls of his palace at night muttering, "Varus, give me back my legions." Not because he'd lost the men, but because something irreplaceable had been torn away. The Aquila mattered because the machine had been designed to make it matter. But psychological bonding alone doesn't make an army. The machine needed engineering. And Rome's military engineers were, in their era, without equal. Start with the basic fighting unit, not the legion but something much smaller. 8 men. The contubernium. 8 soldiers who shared a tent. Who cooked together. Who marched in the same column position every single day. Who had slept beside each other, argued over rations together, buried friends together. Research into military cohesion, from World War II through modern combat studies, consistently identifies the small group as the primary source of battlefield motivation. Soldiers don't charge a fortified position for Rome. They charge it for the 7 men whose names they know. Rome had institutionalized this at scale. The Cantaburnium fed into the century of 80 men, which fed into the cohort, which fed into the legion. Each level had its own identity, its own history, its own competitive pride. Legions kept records of their battles. They carried their history with them. The Legio ex Equestris, Caesar's favored 10th legion, had a reputation it had spent decades building, and every new recruit who joined it inherited that reputation and felt the weight of not dishonoring it. This is tribal psychology, ancient and deep. And Rome had built a bureaucratic structure around it precise enough to make it reliable. Now here is the part most histories skip over. And it is perhaps the most important mechanical insight Rome ever had. The standard Roman javelin, the pilum, was not a weapon designed to kill enemies. It was designed to destroy shields. The pilum's upper section was iron. But that iron was soft near the joint where it met the wooden shaft. When the pilum struck an enemy shield, the iron bent on impact, dragging the weapon at an angle and making it nearly impossible to remove quickly. The enemy had 2 choices. Fight with a suddenly unbalanced shield weighing several extra pounds, or throw the shield away entirely. And they were making that choice at the exact moment the Roman line crashed into them with short stabbing swords. Archaeologists have recovered pila from sites across 3 continents. The engineering is consistent. This wasn't battlefield improvisation. This was systematic weapons design aimed at a specific tactical problem, replicated across an army of hundreds of thousands. Rome had, embedded within its military culture, something that functions like a modern concept, the weapons development cycle. But the pilum was only the beginning, because the real innovation wasn't the weapon. It was how Rome organized the men who carried it. Every previous great army in the ancient world had a structural weakness, and Rome had studied all of them. The Greek phalanx was devastating on flat, open ground. On broken terrain, in narrow passes, fighting uphill or through forest, it became rigid and slow. The Macedonian version under Alexander was even more powerful and even more brittle. A gap in the phalanx line was a catastrophe. It invited immediate exploitation and often caused the entire formation to collapse. Rome watched this, and then built something different. The Postmarian legion was organized into cohorts, 10 cohorts per legion, each capable of operating as a semi-independent unit. The formation could contract or expand, could split and rejoin. The first line could pull back while the second stepped forward, rotating fresh troops into combat in a way no phalanx could ever manage. When a flank was threatened, a cohort could be repositioned. When the terrain changed, the shape of the force changed with it. This sounds like a simple tactical adjustment. It was actually a revolution in organizational thinking. What Rome had built was a military force that could adapt in real time without falling apart. And the reason it could do that without falling apart, the reason rotating lines didn't collapse into panicked chaos, was the psychological architecture underneath. Soldiers trusted the men behind them to step forward. That trust had been built in camp on the march around a shared fire over years. The tactical flexibility of the cohort system was only possible because the human bonds inside the Cantaburnium were strong enough to hold under pressure. The machine and the psychology were inseparable. Then there is what Rome built when the fighting stopped for the night. Every evening, regardless of proximity to the enemy, regardless of terrain, Roman legions constructed a fortified camp. The castra followed a standardized design so consistent that a soldier transferred from Britain to Syria could arrive at his new camp in darkness and immediately know where the commander's tent was, where the latrines were, which gate he would exit from when the battle began. This seems like discipline for its own sake. But the psychology here is precise. Uncertainty kills performance. Not danger, uncertainty. A soldier who doesn't know what comes next, who can't predict his environment, who has no routine to anchor his nervous system, makes worse decisions, sleeps worse, panics faster. The Roman camp was not merely fortification. It was a stress management system. A man who has just marched 20 miles into enemy territory goes to sleep inside a ditch, a rampart, and a known structure. His brain, however primed for threat, has predictability to hold on to. The Greek historian Polybios, who studied the Roman army personally in the mid-2nd century BC, was so astonished by the consistency of Roman camp construction that he dedicated substantial sections of his histories to describing it in precise detail. He recognized he was watching something qualitatively new, an army that built the same city every single night, wherever it happened to be standing. But even a perfect fighting machine needs to eat. And feeding a Roman army on campaign was a logistical challenge that most of Rome's opponents never solved. Most ancient armies traveled with enormous baggage trains, carts, servants, pack animals, merchants, followers of all kinds. These trains were the army's greatest vulnerability. Slow them down, cut them off, burn them, and the army starved. Hannibal understood this intuitively. So did the great Persian commanders. Supply lines were throats waiting to be cut. Marius responded with something brutal in its simplicity. He forced the soldiers to carry everything themselves. Roughly 40 to 60 pounds of equipment, food, and entrenching tools per man. This earned them a nickname that stuck for centuries: Marius's mules. The baggage train shrank dramatically. The army moved faster. The vulnerability decreased. But carrying capacity has limits, and Rome knew it. The deeper solution was infrastructure, built at a scale no previous civilization had ever attempted. The Roman road network, at its height, covered more than 400,000 kilometers, roughly 250,000 miles. These weren't paths worn into the earth by repeated use. They were engineered surfaces, layers of gravel, aggregate, and fitted stone built to precise specifications, capable of bearing heavy loads through mud, snow, and rain. Milestones measured distances to the nearest fraction. Rest stations appeared at regular intervals, stocked with food, fodder, and fresh horses. A Roman army on a Roman road could cover 25 to 30 kilometers per day in standard march conditions. The same force moving through Germanic forest or across trackless, hill country moved at half that speed and arrived depleted. Rome's enemies sometimes discovered, too late, that the legions were moving faster than their scouts had predicted. The road was the weapon. The soldier was what it delivered. Surveyors working today mapping European highways sometimes find that modern roads follow Roman alignments almost exactly, because the Romans found the optimal route 2,000 years ago and engineering hasn't found a better one.